Hey, people. Getting the link and all that stuff. Here we go. No, I'm not looking at the screen. Nice. Up. It's up. Let's see who's here. It's up. Oh, one person watching me now. Thank you very much. Great. Theodore Boone. Oh, three amazing viewers watching me right now. We're going to jump right in just a moment. It's 10:28, so we're actually technically 2 minutes early. I don't know if you saw the read aloud in the last one. We're in the trial. So, how does a courtroom work is the guiding question, and we're going to be doing some writing on this. We'd already learned about the judge, the jury, civil cases versus criminal cases. Civil cases is people suing people around laws and money, and then criminal cases is the state suing, but then possibly putting in jail a person for doing something wrong against the community. It's against the law, but you would say against the community. We lost somebody. There's only two people now. Okay, well, this is good. We're going to really make some progress with the trial. And it's just 10:29 now, so a lot of people aren't dialed in just yet. The judge has a lot of power within his own courtroom. We didn't explain who the bailiff was, but the bailiff is actually like kind of the person who enforces the security of the courtroom. I'm looking it up actually because it's kind of interesting. Like, what is a bailiff? The bailiff isn't the police. Bailiff, define. It's quite a word too. Bailiff, Bailiff. An official in a court of law who keeps order, looks after the prisoners. Ooh, I think that's why the bailiff has to be a police. Yes, a sheriff's officer. You have to be a police person who carries out. Oh, that's British. Ooh, carries out arrests. But if you're in a courtroom, you're already arrested. An official in a court of law who keeps order, looks after prisoners, etc. I love that. What is etc.? Please define etc. What does a bailiff do? There we go. What does a bailiff mean in English? Bailiffs are law enforcement officers, so they are police who are responsible for maintaining order in a courtroom during trials. While their other duties vary from police officer, they do play an important role. So in this case, the bailiff, I think, was that retired police officer. What does bailiff mean in English? A British sheriff. That's where it comes from. Very interesting. All very interesting. All right. Thank you for all 7 of you who are tuned in. It's 10:31. We're just going over what is a bailiff. We didn't get that in a definition. We already in previous days have gone over judge and the 5 things that a judge has to do. Jury, how there's supposed to be 12 jurors and 2 alternates. So an alternate will hear the entire trial, but then won't necessarily vote guilty or not guilty. But they're there in case somebody gets sick or gets excused. You're supposed to be fair and impartial. So definitely, if like a jury starts saying, I hate everybody and I just want them all to be guilty, you'll get excused. Civic responsibilities of people in the United States, part of civics, you are supposed to pay your taxes, observe laws, and serve on a jury if summoned and asked. Those are supposed to be your civic duty as a citizen of the United States. Pay your taxes, observe laws, serve on a jury. Make Mr. Litt chocolate cupcakes. No. That's definitely not. Okay, we got 14 of us now, so it's just time to go. And it's 10:32. They can always play this back if they want. Thank you for your patience. Chapter 6. The government class crossed Main Street and headed east towards the river. Mr. Mount held back a step or two and listened with amusement as the boys argued back and forth about the case. Some of them using phrases and words that they just heard from the lawyers and didn't really understand. This way, said Mr. Mount, and the group hung a left onto the narrow wide street. There they went into Pappy's, a famous deli known for its pastrami subs and onion rings. It was 10 minutes before noon, and they had beaten the rush. They ordered quickly, and they huddled around a long table near the front window. Who was the better lawyer, said Mr. Mount. 10 answered at once, and there was even a split. But they were split between Jack Hogan and Clifford Nance. Remember, Clifford Nance was the defense. Jack Hogan is the prosecution, the district attorney. How does a courtroom work? You have a district attorney bringing this prosecution. Then you have a defense lawyer defending the person accused. Mr. Mount prodded them with questions like, which lawyer do you believe? Which one would you trust? Which one did the jury follow? The food arrived and the conversation stopped. A show of hands, Mr. Mount said, and you must vote. No straddling. Raise your hand if you think Mr. Duffy is guilty. 10 hands out of 15. Okay, not guilty. 5 hands out of 15. Theo, I said you must vote. I can't vote, Mr. Mount. I think he's guilty, but I don't see how the state can prove its case. They can prove a motive. Maybe, but that's it. How does a courtroom work, says Mr. Litt? The state must prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the person is guilty. That is how a courtroom works. The maybe game, huh, said Mr. Mount, just like Clifford Nance said, huh? I thought that was very effective use of words. I'm with Theo, said Aaron. He looks guilty, but the prosecutor can't even place him at the scene of the crime. That's quite a problem, you know. It's a large problem, I'd say, said Mr. Mount. But what about the stolen jewelry and the watches and the guns, said Edward. Did they find his stuff? It was never mentioned. Don't know. But then the opening statements are somewhat limited. Well, they seem pretty long to me, said another kid. We'll find out when the witnesses are called, said Theo. Who's the first witness? Asked Chase. I haven't seen the witness list, said Mr. Mount, but they usually start with the crime scene. It's usually one of the detectives. Cool. How late can we stay, Mr. Mount? We have to be back at school at 3:30. How late will the trial go? Judge Gantry likes to work, said Theo, at least until 5. Afraid not. It's a one-day field trip. You have other classes, you know. None as very exciting as mine, in my opinion, said Mr. Mount. The deli was suddenly packed, and a line formed outside. Mr. Mount told the students, finish up. Pappy, the owner, was famous for barking at people who occupied tables too long after they finished eating. They strolled along Main Street, which was busy now with people scurrying around on their lunch breaks. At a fountain, office workers ate and talked while soaking up the sun. Officer Peacock, the older traffic cop, directed traffic with his worn-out whistle and yellow gloves. Whoa, old school. He managed to prevent accidents, which was not always the case with Officer Peacock. Just ahead, a group of men... and managed to prevent accidents, which wasn't always the case. Okay. There's definitely a theme of older policemen. An older man in this. Is he trying to make some kind of statement here? I don't know. Just ahead, a group of men in dark suits left the building and headed in the same direction as the students. Look, man, it's Mr. Duffy and his lawyers. The boys slowed for a second as the group of dark suits moved in front of them. Pete Duffy, Clifford Nance, and two other lawyers, and a fifth man Theo had not seen in the courtroom that morning, but he knew well. His name was Omar Cheap. Quite a name, huh? Cheepe, Omar Cheap. And he was not a lawyer, but he was well known. Mr. Cheap was a former federal agent of some variety, and he ran his own firm. He was a private detective. He specialized in investigations and surveillance and other activities that lawyers needed from time to time. He and Mr. Boone had once involved in a very nasty dispute and a divorce case. No, Mrs. Boone. She did the divorce lawyer. Excuse me. And Theo heard Omar Cheap described as an armed thug. A man who enjoyed breaking the law. Theo, of course, was not supposed to hear such comments. But then he had heard a lot. He had never actually met Mr. Cheap, but he had seen him in court. The rumor was that if Omar Cheap was working on the case, someone had to be guilty. Omar looked directly at Theo. He was thick, powerfully built with large, round head that he kept shaved. The man tried to look menacing, and he was successful. He turned away and hurried after Duffy. They walked down the main street, the boys in a loose group, moving fast and keeping up with the defendant and the other team. Omar Cheap's frame protected Pete Duffy from the rear. Clifford Nance told a funny story, and everyone had a good laugh. Pete Duffy laughed the loudest. Guilty. Theo hated to believe this because not a single witness had testified. Plus, he liked to tell himself that he believed in the presumption of innocence. How does a courtroom work? You're innocent until proven guilty. Lots of controversy with that one, huh? Guilty, Theo said to himself again. Why couldn't he follow the law? Why couldn't he give Mr. Duffy the benefit of innocence? Why couldn't he do what lawyers were supposed to do? This frustrated him as he followed along behind Mr. Duffy and his lawyers. There was something missing in this case. Based on what had already been said in court, Theo suspected the mystery might never be solved. So Theo was kind of fighting with himself. He's like, this guy's guilty, but wait, no, he's got to be presumed innocent, but kept thinking he's guilty. They filed into their seats, front row, left side of the balcony, and listen, Judge Gantry had recessed until 1, and that was 15 minutes away. Deputy Gossett, the bailiff, lumbered over to them and said, Theo. Yes, sir. Is this your class? What else could it be, Deputy Gossett? A teacher, 16 students. Yes, sir. Judge Gantry would like to see you in chambers. And hurry. He's a busy man. Theo pointed to himself, trying to think of something. The whole class? The whole class, and hurry. They scrambled into formation and Deputy Gossett and hustled down the stairs. In chambers meant the judge was in his office behind the bench. So there's the bench and then he has an office that behind it that you can't see, a closed door. This office was different than his formal office down the hall. It was confusing, and Theo was attempting to explain this when Deputy Gossett opened the door to a long wood-paneled room with old portraits of bearded judges. He stepped out from his desk and greeted the boys. So each judge has two offices. He has his office that he does work in, probably has all his papers. Then he has an office behind the bench. Judges are busy. Theo, he said, embarrassing Theo a little bit. You must be Mr. Mount, the judge was saying, and shook heads. Yes, Judge. This is my 8th grade government class. Since there weren't enough seats for everyone, Judge Gantry addressed the boys where they stood. Thank you for coming. It's important for students to see the judicial system in action. What do you think so far? All 16 boys didn't say a word. What were they supposed to say? Mr. Mount rescued them. They're fascinated by the trial, sir. We just debriefed over lunch. They rated the lawyers. They talked about the jurors. They had a lot of opinions about guilt and innocence. I won't ask, but we have a couple of pretty good lawyers, don't you think? All 16 heads nodded. Is it true that Theo Boone actually gives legal advice A few nervous laughs, and Theo was embarrassed. Yes, but I don't charge them anything, he said. Any questions about the trial? Judge Gantry asked. Yes, sir, said Brandon. On television, you always see a surprise witness that comes out of nowhere and changes the trial. Is there a chance we're going to have a surprise witness here? If not, it seems like the state has a pretty weak case. Good question, son, and the answer is no. Our rules of procedure prohibit surprise witnesses. Television gets it all wrong. Books get it right? I guess this book's trying to get it right. In real life, before the trial starts, each side must provide a list of all people they could potentially call as witnesses. The victim's sister, the lady who found the body, she'll be followed by the detectives. How long can you stay today, boys? We need to be back at school at 3:30, said Mr. Mount. I'll call a recess at 3, and then you can ease out. How are the seats in the balcony? Oh, they're great, and thank you. I moved you down to the floor. Things have cleared out a bit, and again, thanks for taking interest in our judicial system. It's very important for a judicial system to work to have a good government. Judge Gantry was finished. They thanked him, and they shook hands again. Deputy Gossett led them out and back to the courtroom, but this time down to the main aisle, to the second row behind the prosecution's table, not up in the balcony. In front of them were two young men who had been introduced as Mrs. Duffy's sons. The lawyers were a few feet away. Across the aisle, Omar was sitting behind Pete Duffy, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if he might need to look for someone. Once again, he looked directly at Theo. They had gone from the cheap seats to ringside, and they couldn't believe it. And Chase, the scientist, was to the right of Theo's, elbow to elbow, and he whispered, "Did you pull some strings, Theo?" "No, but Judge Gantry and I know each other." "Nice work, Theo." At 1 p.m., the bench bailiff stood and wailed, "Court is now in session. Please remain seated." Judge Gantry appeared in his robe. "The state may call its first witness." From a side door, another bailiff escorted a well-dressed lady to the witness chair. She placed her hand on a Bible, and she swore to tell the truth. When she was seated and the microphone adjusted, Mr. Hogan began his examination. Her name was Emily Green. She was sister of the lady who had deceased, Myra Duffy. She was 44. She lived in Strattonburg. She worked as a fitness counselor, and on the day she died, she had done exactly what Mr. Hogan described in his opening statement. When her sister didn't show for lunch and didn't call, she became worried and panicking. She called her repeatedly on her cell phone. Then she drove to Waverly Creek to the Duffy home and found her sister on the living room carpet, no longer alive. It was obvious, at least to Theo, that Mr. Hogan and Ms. Green had carefully rehearsed what they were going to say. It was designed to establish death and to evoke sympathy. When they finished, Clifford Nance stood and announced that he had no questions on cross-examination. How does a courtroom work? They called a first witness, then the defense is allowed to cross-examine. Ask more questions, basically. Ms. Green was excused, and she took a seat in the front row. Next to her, two nephews, directly in front of the Mount students. The next witness was Detective Crone from the Homicide Department. Using the large screen and the projector, he and Jack Hogan laid out the neighborhood, the Duffy home, the crime scene. Several important facts were established, though the jury already knew them. The front door was found open. The rear door and the side patio were not locked. The alarm system was not engaged or turned on. And new facts emerged. Fingerprint tests found matches throughout the house from Mr. Duffy, Mrs. Duffy, and their housekeeper. But this was to be expected. No other matches were found on doorknobs, windows, phones, drawers, the jewelry case, the antique mahogany box where Mr. Duffy kept his expensive watches. That meant one of two things. The thief-murderer wore gloves or carefully wiped away prints, or the thief-murderer was Mr. Duffy. The housekeeper was not at work the day of the murder. She was out of town with her husband and had a full alibi. Whoever took the jewelry, guns, and watches also yanked open several other cabinets and drawers and flung items on the floor. Detective Crone, who was pretty dull to listen to, methodically went through photo after photo of the mess. For the first time, the trial began to drag. Mr. Mount noticed a few of the boys fidgeting. A couple of the jurors even looked sleepy. At 3 p.m., Judge Gantry banged his gavel and announced a 15-minute recess. The courtroom emptied quickly, and everyone needed a break. Theo and his friends left the courthouse and boarded a small yellow bus. 20 minutes later, they were back at school for dismissal. 30 minutes after he left, Theo was back in the courthouse. He sprinted up the stairs to the third floor. No sign of the Finnemans' divorce anymore. No lawyers in the hallway. No sign of April. She had not called or answered his emails since the night before, nor had she posted anything on the Facebook page. Her parents would not allow her to have a cell phone, so she couldn't text. This was not that unusual. Half the 8th graders at the middle school did not have cell phones. Theo hurried down to the second floor and entered the courtroom. Deputy Gossett gave him a suspicious gaze, but let him find a seat in the third row, behind the defense table. The defendant, Mr. Duffy, sat 20 feet away. Theo could hear the lawyers and whispered important things, and Omar Cheap was still there. He noticed Theo when he sat down. As an experienced observer, Omar had the ability to see all movements, but he did casually, as if he wasn't caring. But he was watching. The witness was a doctor. The medical examiner performed the autopsy. He was using a large color diagram of a human body from the chest up, emphasis on the neck area. Theo paid more attention to Clifford Nance than to the witness. He watched Mr. Nance as he listened intently to the testimony and took notes, and continued and glanced at the jury. He seemed to miss nothing in the courtroom. He was relaxed and confident, but ready to attack if necessary. His cross-examination of the doctor was quick and revealed nothing new. So far, Mr. Nance seemed content to agree with most of the prosecution's witness. The fireworks would come later. Judge Gantry adjourned the court after 5 p.m. Before he excused the jurors, though, he again warned them against discussing the case with anyone. After they filed out, the courtroom empty. Theo hung around watching the lawyers gather their files. So these jurors were allowed to go home, but they're not allowed to talk about the case until it's over. Do you think they really do that? There were no words across the aisle. Jack Hogan said something to Clifford Nance, and both of them laughed. The other lesser lawyer joined in. Someone said, "How about a drink?" Enemies at one moment, old pals the next. Theo had seen this before. His mother tried to explain that lawyers are paid to do a job, and to do it properly they had to park their personal feelings at the door. The real professionals, he said, never lose their cool and never carry grudges. Ike said that was nonsense. He despised most of the lawyers in town. Ike was his uncle, do you remember? Omar Cheap was not laughing, too. He was not invited to have a drink. He and Pete Duffy made a quick exit through the side door. I'll go just a little more. Chapter 7. Tuesday night meant dinner in a soup kitchen. It wasn't the worst meal of the week. That would be Sunday night was the worst meal of the week, when his mother attempted to roast a chicken. But this wasn't great either. The soup kitchen was called just that. It really wasn't a kitchen, and they rarely served soup. It was a large dining room in the basement of a converted church where homeless people gathered to eat and spend the night. The food was prepared by volunteers who offered sandwiches, chips, fruit, cookies. Stuff from a bag, Theo's mother cooked it, called it not that healthy. Theo had heard that there were around 300 homeless people in Strattonburg. He saw them on Main Street, where they begged for money, they slept on benches. He sometimes saw them looking through dumpsters, scrounging around. The city was actually alarmed at this number by the lack of beds and shelters. The city council seemed to argue about this problem every week. Mrs. Boone was alarmed too. She had been so concerned about homeless mothers that she started a program to assist victims of domestic violence. Women who were threatened and had been abused by their husbands. Women who had no place to live and no one to turn to. Women with children who needed help and didn't know where to find it. Mrs. Boone, along with several of the other female lawyers in town, started a small legal clinic to help these women too. So every Tuesday night, the Boone family walked a few blocks from their office to the Highland Street shelter, where they spent 3 hours with the less fortunate. They took their turns serving dinner to the 100 or so folks gathered here, and afterwards they had a little bit of the food themselves. Though he wasn't supposed to know, Theo had overheard his parents discussing whether they should increase their monthly donation to the shelter from $200 to $300. His parents were far from wealthy. His friends thought he was rich because both parents were lawyers, but the truth was that their work was not that profitable. They lived modestly, they saved for Theo's college, and they enjoyed being generous with those who didn't have as much as them. After dinner, Mr. Boone set up a makeshift office at the far end of the dining room, and a few homeless people drifted towards him. He would help them with problems that usually ranged from being evicted from their apartments to being denied food stamps or being denied medical care. He said these were his favorite clients. They couldn't pay him a fee, so there was no pressure to collect from them. They were grateful for whatever he was able to do, and he genuinely enjoyed talking to them. Because of the more sensitive nature of her work, Mrs. Boone saw her clients in a small room upstairs. The first client had 2 small children, no job, no money, and if not for the shelter, no place to sleep that night. Theo's task was to help with homework. The shelter had several families who were allowed to stay up there for up to 12 months. That was the limit at Highland Street shelter. After a year, they'd have to find something else. They'd have to move on. Most of them found jobs and places to live, and it took time, though. While they were in the shelter, they were treated like other residents of Strattonburg. They were fed, they were clothed, they were treated for medical problems. They were employed or looking for work. They were invited to the church for a Sunday prayer. And their children attended the local schools. At night in the shelter, homework sessions were organized by volunteers from the church. Theo's job every Tuesday was to teach English to 2 second graders, Hector and Rita, and help their brother with algebra. They were from El Salvador, and their father had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving them homeless. They were found by the police living under a bridge with their mother. Hector and Rita were thrilled to see Theo, and they clung to him as he ate his sandwich. He scurried down the hall to a large open room where other children were being tutored. "No Spanish," he repeatedly says. "Keep trying your English." Their English was getting good and becoming amazing. They were absorbing it at school, and they were teaching their mother. They found a corner table, and Theo began reading a picture book, something about a frog lost at sea. Mrs. Boone had insisted that Theo start Spanish in the 4th grade, and soon it was offered. When the classes proved too easy, she hired a private tutor who stopped by the office twice a week to give him more rigorous Spanish. With his mother pushing hard, and with Madame Monique giving him daily inspiration, Theo's Spanish was getting very good. He read a page, and then Rita read it back to him. Then Hector. The room was noisy, rowdy, as 24 or so students of all ages plowed through their homework. The twins had an older brother, Julio, a 7th grader. Theo saw occasionally on the playground at school. He was shy to the point of being awkward. Mrs. Boone speculated he was probably scarred from the trauma of losing his father in a strange country where they had no one to turn to. She always had a theory when someone didn't act well. After Theo finished the 2nd book with Hector and Rita, Julio joined them and sat down. "What's up?" said Theo. He just smiled. "Let's read another book." "In a minute." "I'm having trouble with algebra," said Julio. "Can you help me?" "He's with us," said Rita. Theo picked out 2 books from his shelf and placed them before Hector and Rita. "Read these books. Say every word you can, read, and when you don't see a word you don't know, write it down." Theo and Julio were soon lost in the world of pre-algebra. Okay, so we'll pick this up tomorrow. More stuff unfolds about April and the trial, and it gets a bit more interesting. Oh, yes. Yeah, there's a reason they talk about the shelter, and all this is actually going to come together, and it's going to have to do with the big trial. And of course, Theo is going to get thrust in the center, as he always does, because John Grisham does not write books that don't have some kind of building climax. So I know we're doing a lot of work building the story, but it's all the pieces will come together. Think about it like a detective mystery, okay? All right, so I'm going to see half the 4th grade for math. That's Amina, Callie, Bronner, Jira, Corley, Henry today. And at 11:30, I'm going to see Alana, Lila, Akila, Journey, Jasmine, Ed, Logan, Sean, Claire. It's on the schedule.